Hello and welcome back into Big Red Huddle. Today we're going to talk all things signing day. We also had Matt Rhule's press conference on Wednesday, which provided some good information, some juicy nuggets there. We are going to get into a few Nebraska basketball topics, a rough week for the boys on the hardwood. Do have some good things to look forward to as the schedule loosens up. And then we'll finish up the show with a couple of national storylines. Obviously, we have the Super Bowl coming up tomorrow, so we'll provide our prediction as everyone else is doing. And so with that, let's huddle up and get into the information. So this past Wednesday was our traditional signing day. Only two really notable new signings that took place this last week, which is really interesting. If you go back and listen to last week's edition, we really thought the roster at that point in time was pretty well solidified. We had started to move forward towards spring ball, winter conditioning, and things of that nature. A couple things happened, though, last weekend that really changed some things. And so the biggest name from an addition perspective, Keona Wilhite, defensive line, really an edge rusher out of Tucson, Arizona, 6'5", 240 pounds. Anywhere from a 3-4 star, depending on what service you follow. His story is really interesting. He committed to Arizona last summer, later committed this fall and flipped to Washington, actually signed his national letter of intent with Washington in December. If you go back and listen to Kalen DeBoer's signing day press conference in December, he was extremely high on Wilhite and how he projects in the Big Ten. As everybody knows by now, Kalen DeBoer ultimately takes the Alabama job, leaves Washington. Keona Wilhite opens up his recruitment. Washington lets him out of his national letter of intent. And that's really where Nebraska took advantage of an opportunity. There was an established relationship there from over the summer. Keona visited Michigan State, also Nebraska during this winter period. He had visited UCLA over the summer, so it really came down to those three schools. When we recorded last week, several crystal balls, projections, right, whatever you want to look at, had Keona going to UCLA. After that occurred, rumors started to come out about Chip Kelly interviewing for NFL OC jobs, which we talked about last week, coincidentally enough. And so as you think about Keona's situation, he was with her. He committed to Arizona. Arizona's coach is now at Washington. He committed to Washington. Washington coach is now at Alabama. As he was approaching UCLA, you started to have those rumors of Chip Kelly moving to the NFL. And so really the stability at Nebraska with Matt Rhule and Knighton really is what probably, I think, at the end drew Keona Wilhite to Nebraska. I've heard him referred to as like a make room type of prospect. We go back to last week, we talked about the numbers. We were at 149 on the roster holistically from a scholarship distribution chart, right, which ebbs and flows probably around 95 to 100. But this is just a guy that if he's available, you've got to make room for him. He's really the only true edge rusher in this class. And so, and he's also a bigger edge rusher, which I like, because as we are starting to learn more and more, and have seen a full season now of this 3-3-5, you need those guys up front to be of the bigger variety. And so he's not a nose by any means. He's more of that end in a 3-3-5. Maybe early on in his career he could be in a jack role, but I think he's really destined for that end position. So really excited about Keona Wilhite. Kind of a late addition off many people's radar several weeks ago, and kind of a steal there at the end for Nebraska. Then the second big name was Kamir Prescott, a 6'1" safety out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's a 3-star prospect off of most services. He actually visited last spring at Nebraska. He was one of the early prospects that Evan Cooper and Matt Rhule really narrowed in on from a defensive back perspective in this class. But ultimately, he committed to Wisconsin last spring. I think in the April timeframe, and had been a commitment all the way up until December 7th when he ultimately decommitted from Wisconsin and didn't sign anywhere in the early period. Not really clear what happened there. It's been kind of communicated as a mutual parting of ways. Some thoughts out there is that maybe it's grades related or admissions related into Wisconsin. It's pretty tough to get into Wisconsin in comparison to some other schools. Obviously, I cannot confirm this. It's only speculation that I've seen some national writers, but I've also seen some say he's our 10th, which is remarkable to say, 10th defensive back prospect in this class. And some are saying that he could be the best of the group. Now, I think Buford's probably number one for me. But Kamir Prescott, he's a hitter. He's aggressive. He comes down. He's not afraid of contact. Probably is more of a true safety versus any type of cornerback or nickel type of DB. But the biggest story for me with this commitment is, again, the powerful aspect that we have at Nebraska with our NIL and 1890 specifically. This is a true walk-on that's receiving NIL to assist with his tuition and other expenses. So he's not going to count against the 85, at least initially. But for all intents and purposes, he's a scholarship-worthy athlete, and just a really big steal late in the process for Nebraska. He's one that could hit the field early, either with special teams. Probably not as a true safety, but I could see him playing special teams or at least getting up to the 4-game rule in 2024. So excited about both of those late additions. So several other walk-ons, traditional walk-ons signed last week on Wednesday. I'm not going to walk through those. Takes the roster much higher. 151, I think, is what I saw recently. With some of the additional walk-ons that signed this last week, it could be closer to 155. Something we'll continue to monitor. Not anything that's to get crazy over or have any anxiety about. Coaches will figure it out, but just something I enjoy tracking, and just as the roster develops over the course of winter and then ultimately into spring and summer. So let's transition then. Wednesday, Matt Rhule held his National Signing Day press conference. He obviously spoke about those two prospects. I don't want to get into that as much as some of the other juicy nuggets that I took from the press conference. We have been talking on this podcast for the last several weeks around Glenn Thomas, the co-offensive coordinator and QB coach, what his influence in the offense would be, his influence with the quarterbacks, etc. And Matt Rhule was very clear in his press conference on Wednesday that Marcus Satterfield is the OC. He's the leader of that room. He's the leader on that side of the ball. He will be calling the plays. Glenn Thomas is coming in as a collaborator. Obviously, a co-offensive coordinator will help in the day-to-day development of the play calling and of the play development. But when it comes to game day, Marcus Satterfield is the true offensive coordinator. So not that there was a lot of questions there, but whenever you give somebody a co-offensive coordinator title, certainly a question that's needs to be asked and answered, and I appreciate Matt Rhule's straightforwardness when it comes to that answer. And so I'm going to talk about Glenn Thomas here in our next bullet point here, but continuing on Matt Rhule's press conference, from an individual player perspective, there were really two points that stuck out to me, which were, juicy if you want to use that vocabulary, but I thought were really telling. First being Jamal Banks, the wide receiver transfer from Wake Forest. If you remember from last winter, the staff creates this, everything within the program is built around competition. So they divide the team up into these mini teams of anywhere from 8 to 12 individuals, and they really compete on a day in and day out basis. They gain points based off of how they're doing in the classroom, different community service opportunities, going to other Husker sporting events, obviously the workouts, etc. And Matt Rhule is very clear that Jamal Banks is clear and far ahead of anybody else on the team. He is setting the standard for the team holistically. For a transfer to come in and make that type of impact in just two or 3 weeks, pretty remarkable and certainly something to be excited about. But what was even if you dove deeper into his comments, Matt Rhule's comments in the press conference, he spoke about how last year's good, last year's great is this year's good, right? So always raising the standard, raising the bar. It's so far ahead from a culture perspective and expectation perspective, both for the staff and the team, of what the standard is at Nebraska. And when you have somebody like Jamal Banks coming in and raising that standard, others around him are going to have to raise with him. And so for me, that's exciting as we start to look at spring ball and then ultimately into the fall. Because I think we all realize, players included, fans obviously, how close we were in those last 4 games of kind of getting over this hump. Matt Rhule said it, we're a 5-7 football team until we're not. But you go back and look at those last 4 games, and I don't want to rehash it, but we're a play or two away from being 8-4. I mean, that's how close this team is. And so if we can raise those standards and do those little things now over the next 7 months, should get you pretty excited as we approach spring ball and then ultimately August. And so then, kind of on the opposite side of that coin, he was asked about Micah Mazuka. And in his comments, you could take them as somewhat troubling. I'm not taking them as troubling, but he pointed out that all of those things that Jamal Banks is doing in setting that standard and taking good to great, Micah Mazuka has a lot of opportunity to do those things. He needs to buy in, put forth that effort on and off the field. He's not going to be handed anything, no matter, his 21 starts at the Power 5, probably the most talented offensive lineman and one of the more experienced offensive linemen we have in the program. He needs to do all these things in the offseason to earn that credibility, to earn that respect of his teammates, and then ultimately, achieve that playing time. Now, take everybody back to last spring. We heard very similar comments about Anthony Grant, Tommy Hill. In fact, both were suspended on day 1 of spring ball, if you recall. Tommy Hill turned out to be one of the most important people on this team from a defensive back perspective. Matt Rhule just loves the guy, talks glowingly about him. In the fall, one of the more highly rated defensive backs by the end of the year. Anthony Grant, put his fumbling to the side, played a big role in 2023. So with that, Matt Rhule does a great job of speaking to his team and speaking to his players through the media. Guarantee he's had these conversations directly with Micah Mazuka. This is nothing new. Mike is not hearing it for the first time. So let's let this play out over the next, several months, get through spring ball, and just see how Micah responds to this. And, Micah's personality is pretty no nonsense, and I would expect him to take that, if you want to call it criticism, and respond in a very favorable manner. So I think when we get to August, Micah is still a big part of this offensive line for the 2024 season, and just interesting comments from Matt Rhule. And then kind of wrap up this segment, some injury news coming into spring. Nothing overly surprising here. Gabe Irvin with his hip, Ramir Johnson shoulder, both are out for spring ball. That should create a huge opportunity for Dante Dowdell, Emmett Johnson, and Quentin Ives. I don't think there's any question Emmett Johnson comes into the spring as the number 1 back. He earned that through the last 6 to 8 games of 2023. But Dante Dowdell is going to be a big story in spring ball, and I'm excited about his build, the way he plays the game. We'll see how he fits in. I like the combination of Emmett more as like a slasher, Dante Dowdell as a bowling ball. That excites me. I don't know much about, we haven't seen Quentin Ives. I know the staff's really high on Quentin, so we'll get a good look at him this spring. Malachi Coleman, Princewill, most likely out with shoulder surgery that took place this winter. Turner Corcoran out for the spring. He seems like the more longer term injury at this point. I think Matt Rhule even said he's questionable for the start of fall camp. Interesting piece here for Turner Corcoran. He hasn't redshirted yet, so if this injury were to linger into the season, it'll be fascinating to see if he ultimately takes a red shirt and comes back in 2025. It feels like Corcoran's already been around forever, but there's a path there. If this, depending on how this rehab goes, that you could see him red shirt, and you could see him on the similar as the Buford route from 2023, play the last 4 games of the year and then get a full 2025. So something to monitor there. And then on the positive side of the coin, it sounds like Maverick Noonan is coming along really well, nearly fully cleared, should be a full participant in spring ball. He had his season cut short last year with the knee injury. So excited to see him from that edge position, and good to see him fully rehabbed and ready to go. So shifting to quarterback, another kind of fascinating topic from the Matt Rhule press conference was just, he talked extensively about Glenn Thomas, his history, between the two of them, his recent employment there at the Pittsburgh Steelers. It sounds like that. This whole transition from Pittsburgh to Nebraska has been in the works for several weeks, maybe even a couple months now, as he finished out his obligations there in Pittsburgh. We've talked about Glenn Thomas. We talked about Glenn Thomas for several weeks before it ever became official, so that news or those nuggets didn't surprise me. What was fascinating to me is how he talked about Glenn Thomas and his development historically of quarterbacks at both Temple and Baylor. He even talked about his time in Atlanta with Matt Ryan. And one thing that was interesting to me is how he described he wanted his QB coach to be focused on QBs and not necessarily the offensive coordinator, as the offensive coordinator tends to get pulled away from their position group. And he, with 2 true freshmen and Heinrich, who's lacking experience, he wanted and needs a dedicated coach with that QB room, every step of the way, which I think is good. I mentioned before, I'm not down on Marcus Satterfield from a coordinator. I think that's an incomplete grade. Very clearly, he's not a quarterback coach. I don't know that anybody can watch 2023 and be totally satisfied with the quarterback play. And we saw a lot of consistencies there, no matter who is behind center. So you've got to put that back on the coach at some point. So I'm excited about Glenn Thomas. His track record speaks for itself. I know he's got the trust of both Matt Rhule and Marcus Satterfield to have him dedicated to QBs. I truly expect a jump there from that room. Obviously, when you add a talent like Raiola, that's always going to help. But obviously, there's much more to quarterback than just the physicality and the physical traits that come with the position. So I'm fascinated with that. Glenn Thomas is actually going to speak for the first time on Monday. So I'll be interested to hear from him. Haven't heard from him yet as a member of the coaching staff. So looking forward to that. And we'll certainly report back on next week's edition of what comes out of that setting. So looking at the 2025 QB board, not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we have been discussing this the last several weeks as it's developed in real time pretty quickly. Not a lot of movement this last week as the coaches are now off the road recruiting, and we're in this dead period through February. But we did mention last week Madden Imalava. He's a 6'3", 185-pound QB out of Warren, California. He's the younger brother of Tennessee QB Nico Imalava, who started against Iowa in their bowl game and then will be the full-time starting quarterback this season. He's got offers from everybody under the sun: Auburn, Cal, Colorado, Miami, Ole Miss, TCU, Tennessee. Consensus 4-star, top 200 prospect across the board. But the biggest news that came out of him is that he confirmed with multiple outlets he's looking to visit over the spring. Unsure if it'll be the weekend of the spring game or another weekend in late March, early April. But what I'm looking for with the 2025 QB recruiting is who makes it to campus. And to hear that Madden is planning his trip to Lincoln, that's a big development. And he's probably the most talented one that's still on the board for Nebraska. So with that, we mentioned Matt Zoller several times. He received an offer a couple weeks ago out of Royersford, Pennsylvania. He released his top 4 this week, and Nebraska was not part of that. Penn State, Pitt, Missouri, Georgia. So you can probably cross him off the board. But a familiar name maybe is popping back up on the board, and that's Stone Saunders, 6'2", 200-pound QB out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He was, this time last year, probably the number 1 target on the board for Nebraska before ultimately committing to Kentucky last summer. And there's some undercurrent behind the scenes of some of the assistant coaches, one assistant coach specifically that could be looking to bounce to the NFL. Nebraska may be potentially circling back to Stone Saunders. And so if I was to break it down right now, I think Madden Amalava is probably number 1. Stone Saunders is maybe a sleeper. He's still committed to Kentucky, but somebody to keep an eye on. And then there's a couple others that are out there that worth noting. There was a new offer that came out this week to TJ Latif out of Orange, California. Don't know much about him. He's another consensus 4-star, but we'll have to see and wait and see how that relationship grows and develops. Because again, what I'm looking for now is who makes it to campus in March. So February is a dead period. You're not going to see any movement over the next 3 or 4 weeks. But then ultimately, who makes it to campus when that opens back up in March? And so we'll keep an eye on that. Just to kind of wrap up football and Matt Rhule's press conference, he did talk about the possibility of grabbing a 4th QB out of that spring portal. And so I found his answer really interesting in that with 3 extremely young scholarship QBs, spring is going to provide them all to get a ton of individual reps and also team reps. It'll give the coaches an opportunity to evaluate where they're at, and then they can dive into the spring portal if they feel like a 4th QB is needed. He's traditionally wanted or has operated with 4 scholarship QBs. He's done it with 3 in the past. I think a lot of that decision is going to come down to what it looks like in spring. Are there at least 2 of the 3 that you feel really comfortable with going into the season? Because if you look historically at Nebraska over the last 10 years, I'm not sure we've made it a full season without having to go to the backup at some point, and some years 3, like last year. So obviously we'll watch spring very closely, but I wouldn't rule out that possibility. And we've talked about it in previous episodes that that spring transfer portal situation could be pretty fascinating for Nebraska and something to watch going forward. So that's football. That's where we're at. We'll monitor the Glenn Thomas press conference on Monday. We've got winter conditioning, obviously, going. We got mat drills that kicked off last week. So probably not a lot of news next week, probably a slower news week. But as always, we'll continue to monitor, and that's really where our bread and butter is on the football side of the athletic department. But with that, we should transition into some basketball. It was a rough week for Nebraska basketball. When we chatted last Saturday, we talked about the huge opportunity in front of this team. 2 road games at Illinois, at Northwestern. I couldn't have been more wrong in my projection of these 2. I said on the podcast last Saturday that I felt the Illinois game was an awful matchup for Nebraska. The Northwestern game was much more gettable. and it couldn't have been more opposite. So the Illinois game ends just in devastating fashion, 87-84 in overtime. Nebraska's down 10 late, goes on an 11-1 run to force overtime. Actually had a 1-point lead with about 15 seconds to go. There's a debate, at least in my house, whether there was a foul there at the end of regulation. I say no. Was there contact? Sure, but that's a tough call to make at the end of a game. Illinois steps up, hits 1 out of 2, go to overtime. Several 50-50 calls don't go our way, which don't expect on the road. And ultimately we fall. Just would have been a massive win for this team if we could have got that one. We've been somewhat critical on this podcast of Tominaga. Can't be critical of his game in Illinois. He went up against one of the toughest defenders in the league, drops a career high 31. Just incredible movement off the ball, was hitting everything. And this is what I've talked about in the past. When he's hot early, and he was hot early, you can ride him and ride that momentum through these games. But if he's cold at the beginning, that's where you got to pull him. And Fred's done a fantastic job of judging that early in games and then managing the game accordingly. So that's Illinois. Moved to Northwestern on Wednesday night. This one got ugly early. 10 minutes in, I think Northwestern had 25 points already. We were down double digits throughout. Just lacked defensive intensity, out-rebounded again, tons of turnovers, 17, 18 turnovers. Really the story all season outside of Illinois and Kansas State. This team has just not figured out a way to perform and bring that same level of intensity on the road. A lot of teams in college basketball can say that, but if this team wants to make the NCAA tournament, which is the ultimate goal, have to find a way to get a couple of these road wins. So we wrapped up this 4-game stretch. We've been talking about it the last couple weeks. I was really hoping we could find a way to go 2-2. That didn't happen. Finished 1-3. Obviously avoided just the awful situation of 0-4. Got that game against Wisconsin. But as we start to think about net rankings and bracketology, it's been a rough week. There's been several examples, but specifically, I'll bring up Wisconsin. They've now lost 4 in a row. Couple of pretty bad losses too. Obviously Nebraska beat them. That's not a bad loss. They lost at home to Purdue. There's nothing wrong with losing to the number 1 team in the country, depending on the rankings. But Wednesday night at Michigan, dead last in the league. They dropped that one. And then earlier today on Saturday at Rutgers, lose by 22, 78-56. So not really sure what's going on there, but one of the big feathers in Nebraska's cap from an NCAA tournament perspective were their 2 huge home wins against the number 1 ranked Purdue, number 6 ranked Wisconsin. Purdue's going to be a top 4 team no matter what, so that there's nothing that's going to change there. But now Wisconsin with 4 straight losses in the last 2 to some pretty bad teams, that win is not looking as good as it once did. I guess on the positive side, Kansas State did take down Kansas, so that helps on the Kansas State side, but that's still only a quad 2 win. And so as we bring this forward, as of Saturday morning, had Nebraska in the net rankings at 57. Got to figure out a way to pull that up. Joe Lunardi, ESPN, has Nebraska as 11 seed playing Colorado State. CBS, Jerry Palm has Nebraska as last 4 in, playing in Dayton versus Texas A&M as an 11 seed. Maybe we'll talk about this on future podcasts, but this is an interesting question for me. I'd love to hear some comments or your thoughts. If Nebraska goes to and plays in what I'm going to call a play-in game in Dayton, and let's just use this scenario, and they beat Texas A&M, do you count that as an NCAA tournament win? Is that Nebraska's first NCAA tournament win? I know officially the answer is yes. Just feels dirty to me. All right. For me, I need to see them win on a Thursday or Friday for me to feel like it's a legit NCAA tournament win. So we've got to figure out a way to get out of that play-in game situation. And as we look at the rest of the schedule, this is where it's pro and con. The pro is we've got the easiest schedule left in the Big Ten. We don't play another opponent above 71 in the net. In fact, Michigan's in the hundreds. Rutgers and Indiana and Penn State are all in the 90s. And so the pro is we've got 7 games left, 4 at home, 3 on the road. Conceivably could be favored in all 7. Perhaps an underdog at Ohio State just slightly. Here's how I break down these last 7 games. If we go 6-1, we're in. Doesn't matter what we do in the Big Ten tournament. 5-2 probably depends on the 2. There's a couple of landmines in here from a bad loss perspective. Any of these games at home are bad losses. Have to win all 4 at home. Michigan, Penn State, Minnesota, Rutgers. So 5-2, I think we're still in. I would want a game in the Big Ten tournament to solidify that. 4-3, we've got to win a couple games in the Big Ten tournament to feel good. Anything worse than 4-3, we're out. 4-3, and you go in the Big Ten tournament, lose game 1, you're out. Maybe even game 2, you're out. 5-2 is the absolute minimum that we have to go over these last 7. And I think we would still need 1 or 2 in the tournament. 6-1, we're in. 6-1 would include 2 road wins. So road games at Indiana, at Ohio State, at Michigan. No reason to lose at Indiana or at Michigan. And then we've got at Ohio State. That's maybe a little bit more difficult, but they're sliding currently. And so we're not going 7-0. Those of us that have followed Nebraska basketball know that the basketball gods won't allow that to happen. But figure out a way to go 5-2. Figure out a way to go 6-1, and let's solidify our position in the NCAA tournament. So Michigan tonight. Let's take it one game at a time. Michigan tonight, 10.5-point favorite. Doug McDaniel. Perhaps Michigan's best player is out. Kind of an odd situation there, an academic suspension, if you will. He is not playing road games. He is playing home games, and so should be nothing's easy with Nebraska basketball, but should be a pretty easy game tonight. Hopefully I didn't just jinx us, get this one. But then at Michigan to end the year, I'm fascinated with that. Doug McDaniel will be in the lineup there. Michigan just beat Wisconsin. And so we'll continue to follow it. Obviously, it's a fun team. It's been enjoyable. 16-8, 6-7 overall. I'm going to say we go 6-1 to finish this off. Probably a 4, 5, 6 seed in the Big Ten tournament. See what the matchup is there, but 6-1 is my guess. So let's start to wrap things up. National storylines, just real quick. Want to hit on really just one big one. Friday afternoon, evening, Chip Kelly announced that he's stepping down at UCLA. He's taking the OC position at Ohio State. We had talked about Chip Kelly last week, actually, where with some of those rumors of him going to the NFL. Didn't see him stepping down for a college OC job. So this was an interesting move. If you just start to peel back the onion a little bit, though, Chip Kelly, Ryan Day played for Chip Kelly in New Hampshire, and actually coached under Chip Kelly at a few other stops along the way. So impacts to Nebraska, potentially 2 levels here. Nebraska goes to Ohio State. Ohio State's absolutely loaded. I don't know if it matters if Chip Kelly's there or not. I do think for Ohio State, they lucked into a fantastic hire here. I'm not a fan of Bill O'Brien, who was the OC there for just a couple weeks before he took the Boston College job Friday. And then UCLA comes to Lincoln in November next year, which I've always thought was a winnable game, and was excited about the prospects of UCLA coming to Lincoln in November. UCLA already was ranked around the 95th in returning production, and that's before the 30-day transfer window now opens up with Chip leaving. UCLA's schedule is brutal, includes LSU, Oregon, Penn State, Nebraska, Washington, and USC. So it'll be fascinating to see who takes that job. PJ Fleck was an early name that came out for per Brett McMurphy. I'm also going to keep an eye. I don't want to scare anybody, but I'm keeping an eye on Tony White here. Tony White, if you recall, played at UCLA, an alum of UCLA. I think if UCLA hired Tony White, it'd be a home run. I don't know if it's a big enough name for what UCLA is looking for, but keep an eye on that. I think his name's going to pop up there over the course of the next week, but fascinated to see which direction UCLA goes. And then we'll wrap up Super Bowl. Super Bowl is tomorrow, Chiefs versus 49ers. I'm going Chiefs. Chiefs 27, 49ers 21 would be my pick. I'm just not betting against Patrick Mahomes. I'm a huge Brock Purdy fan. I don't know why he gets as much hate as he does. Obviously his first Super Bowl, though, going against Patrick Mahomes. This is his fourth Super Bowl. Goes without saying that's it. That's the biggest stage there is when it comes to football. So I'm going Chiefs. I'm not confident in that pick. Let's see if the 49ers stick to the run game, feed Christian McCaffrey, take some of the burden off of Brock Purdy. If they do that, which the Ravens failed to do, then I'd get more confident in the 49ers than the Chiefs. But it comes down to it, the game's about quarterback play, and I'm taking Patrick Mahomes in this one. So Chiefs 27, 49ers 21. We'll see how bad we do on that when we get together next week. So with that, let's wrap up. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen. If you can get us on Spotify, iTunes, you can get us on YouTube, all of those at Big Red Huddle. Subscribe, like, leave a review. Appreciate all the feedback. You can find us on X at Big Red Huddle. So with that, we will wrap up, and we will we will speak with you next weekend when we huddle up again. Go Big Red. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.